Hello, we're going for a little bit of a cozier vibe today. Um, but somebody in my Discord gave me this wonderful video idea of if I had to split the 6 origin characters in Baldur's Gate 3 into 3 separate couples, what would they be and why? And my initial reaction was, what do you mean I have to split them? Can't they all hold hands together? Because I'm a big believer in your Baldur's Gate camp being a giant polycule. That's how I play the game. That's ideal for me. But how would I split them up into duos if I had to? And I enjoy every ship iteration, I think. Most of the popular ones that I've seen have all been really fun for me. But how would I split them up if I had to specifically handcraft these couples, and why would I pick these 3 couples over any other combination of companions? So my gut reaction is I wanted to put Karlach and Shadowheart together because it's love at first sight for those two, or at least on Shadowheart's part. And given that Karlach and Shadowheart are both taken off the market, I would also want to put Wyll and Astarion together because I'm a Wyll-Starion lover. I think they're very cute. I love the dynamic of Astarion looking at Wyll and being like, that's the kind of guy that I would have dreamed about marrying when I was 13 years old. And just the idea of a monster hunter falling in love with a monster just really appeals to me. And then that leaves us with Gale and Lae'zel together. And while I can see Gale being very into Lae'zel and they would have a lot of bonding over sharing a love for knowledge and maybe sharing each other's cultures with one another, I can't fully get on board with the idea of Lae'zel loving Gale as an individual unit. So then I have to rework this whole thing, and that puts me thinking, my lineup, the one I'm locking in, Wyll and Karlach, Bloodweave, the Astarion and Gale, and our toxic Yuri, Lae'zel and Shadowheart. And let me explain. Right, so we'll start with Karlach and Wyll because that's going to be the easier one. Karlach and Wyll, when they first meet each other, there is kind of this back and forth, obviously, because Wyll is tasked with basically killing Karlach, but they become such fast friends after the fact. They both have very similar values and morality, and they just get along very well. I think they're cute. They also both have the end game goals of having to fight it out in Avernus for a while, so as a duo, that just makes sense. And Wyll is the only companion that basically volunteers to help Karlach after the events of the game. I don't think this is a note against the other companions because I do genuinely believe all of the companions have grown to care for one another over the course of the game, but Wyll is the only one who's like, hey, I'll go to Avernus with you. We can go kick devil ass together and try to fix your heart, and they do that. And there is a little bit of, I guess, inferred context in the epilogue party where it does kind of sound like Karlach and Wyll either are together or are gaining interest in one another romantically. So I think those two together make a lot of sense for me. Moving on to Gale and Astarion. They both have wine unt vibes in very different ways. I love the Bloodweave ship because it's basically like if bullying was a love language, but the bullying is very superficial, because Astarion, to me, seems like the kind of guy who would show that he cares through saying just silly things. And we see in the game that he does care about Gale, but it's in a very passive-aggressive way. For example, when you find out that Mystra asks for Gale to basically kill himself, Astarion is kind of angry about that. He's like, why would we do that? That's horrible and I guess a waste of a perfectly good Gale. Like, he's very dismissive about it, but it's, to me, very obvious that he does genuinely care for Gale in this moment, and he's upset for Gale because of what Mystra is asking of him. And with that in mind, I do love the interpretation of Bloodweave that looks at them as Astarion is just staying on Gale's nerves, and honestly, Gale does it back to Astarion, but it comes from a place of, like, love and friendship instead of a place of, like, maliciousness, right? So I feel like those two could get on very well in that sort of sense. And also, when we look at their actual, like, romance paths, Astarion is a character that thinks his only worth is his body and what he can do physically for another person. And Gale's romance, his Act 2 romance scene, you have an option to sleep with him without physically sleeping with him. It's like, it's all metaphysical. And it would take Astarion out of his body. It would create an experience for him where it's not about what he can do for Gale and what his body can be, but more about a genuine intimate connection. And on the flip side, Gale is a kind of character that believes the only value he brings to a relationship is his magic. And Astarion could, with his I hate to put it this way, but with his experiences with intimacy and the way that he does believe that his body is kind of like the thing he brings to the table, it would create or allow for them to create an environment where Gale is not just the magic man. Gale is a physical human being, and magic doesn't really affect their relationship. So they could both play off of each other's insecurities and their strengths very, very well, and I think that's beautiful. This video is completely unscripted, so I feel like that could have been put a lot more eloquently and maybe with a lot more, like, supporting evidence, but these are just, like, my thoughts. Like I said, this is a cozy video. Happy Pride. And finally, we have our toxic Yuri, Lae'zel and Shadowheart, and this one might be a little bit harder for me to defend. I will admit, part of why they're, like, one of my favorite ships in Baldur's Gate is because I do enjoy a good enemies to lovers story. I think having characters that are so diametrically opposed at the beginning learn to accept and even appreciate one another is something that just really appeals to me. Watching characters that see each other at their worst develop a bond and grow to like each other despite getting to know each other at their worst selves, like, that's true love. Like, if you start out as enemies and you are able to still create a bond strong enough to allow for a love to flourish, like, that's truly something. But Lae'zel and Shadowheart aren't exactly enemies. They're more like aggressive, starting off on the wrong foot, because again, with Shadowheart's story, she was sent to retrieve this relic from the Gith and was trained to be very distrustful of Gith. That's like the only thing she's got in her brain right now. And Lae'zel sees that Shadowheart is being kind of racist towards her and has this relic that's important to her people, and also Lae'zel's just a little abrasive at times, and when those two clash together, it makes them seem like they hate each other more than they really do. So they're not exactly enemies to lovers, but they can kind of sit in a very similar spot where they're set up to not really see the best in one another, but through getting to know each other, they're able to say, like, oh, wait, this girl's not that bad. Like, this girl has a lot of things to love, and I just think it's kind of cool to watch a relationship flourish out of something that would initially prevent a relationship of any sort to form. Any sort of bond would be strained under the circumstances that Shadowheart and Lae'zel first meet. So the idea that they are able to overcome that and really get to know one another just it speaks to me. And it's also kind of cool. Lae'zel is a person who was raised to value one's strength in battle. And as the game goes on, she will compliment Shadowheart for how far that she's come in your fights, in your battles. And I feel like in a way that's Lae'zel showing that she does care and that she is noticing these things that to her are like a really big deal or something that is a huge compliment. And on the flip side, Shadowheart does become a lot less abrasive towards Lae'zel. I wish we got to see the companions interact with each other a lot more outside of like party banter here and there when walking around. But Shadowheart does seem to care about where Lae'zel's story is going, and vice versa. The companions always have so much to say. Okay, maybe not so much to say, but they always have like a reaction to big story beats in the other companions' stories. And they're all caring about one another, and that includes Shadowheart and Lae'zel. I know the question was mostly like how I would split up the main 6 into their 3 couples, but when we throw Halsin and Minthara in the mix, I feel like that really kind of spices things up a bit, because obviously Halsin and Minthara cannot go together. Minthara is a lesbian. This is partially a joke. I know most of the companions are pansexual or bi to some degree. I know it's been specifically stated that Astarion is pan, and I think it makes sense for all of the companions to be pansexual because they all show interest in you. And other than Minthara, I think the romance is basically the same, regardless on what gender you play as. And to me personally, pansexual means that you love multiple genders regardless of their gender. Like the gender of the person you're interested in does not factor in how you love them. That's my understanding. I don't think I'm pansexual. So again, my understanding is probably not going to be like the end-all be-all of what pansexual means. And also, it's going to mean slightly different things to different people because, again, the labels fit. We make the labels fit us. We don't make ourselves to fit the labels. Minthara and Lae'zel they could definitely be a couple or like an item or something because they both are very strong-willed, and also Lae'zel is like the only companion Minthara like praises. They do seem to like each other and they seem to value one another, and Minthara sees what Lae'zel can bring to the table and she's vibing. Also, just Minthara comes from a matriarchal society, so she's going to be quicker, I think, to see the value in women. Halsin is a character that I feel like isn't too picky on who he loves, although I do really like Halsin and Astarion as a ship together, because I often see Halsin as a character who can really be there for Astarion when it comes to him learning about bodily autonomy and learning to reclaim his voice and his power in terms of sexuality and autonomy. And Halsin as a character is also like very consent is important. I'm not going to like do anything or pursue anything without like your consent, your partner's consent. And he himself has a history of sexual assault, basically. So he understands what it feels like to be in a situation like Astarion. He understands what it feels like to have that power and that autonomy stripped away. And he knows the struggle to get it back and to reclaim yourself. And while I think Halsin has completed that journey, Astarion is starting that journey throughout the game. Like, he really doesn't start it until mid-Act 2, not really, like, fully going into it until Act 3. Recovery from that type of trauma is incredibly difficult, and having a support network that understands what you're going through is pretty key in understanding what you're feeling, understanding what you're going through, and also just, like, it's helpful and it's nice to know that there's somebody on your side who understands. And I think Astarion really needs that. And on the flip side, I think Halsin is just gonna have fun with Astarion. I think Astarion is very funny. Halsin's sense of humor is a little kind of like hard to gauge. I don't think a lot of his character gets to like shine through. I'm speaking like Halsin is a real person. there's a lot of aspects that Halsin would have as a real person that don't get to shine through as strongly as they do with the other companions. But Halsin does kind of have this very, like, taking things literal sense of humor, or, like, thought pattern process thing. Because when, in the epilogue, when he says he's all ears, he does take a step back and he's like, that kind of weirds me out. I don't like that phrase, because I think about what that's gonna look like, what that would literally mean, and it's kind of like giving him the ick. But I feel like because he kind of thinks that way, that's very similar in how I think sometimes, and I really like Astarion's humor, and I think that's a good mesh. I think that they would be able to kind of bounce off of one another pretty well, and I just think they'd have a good time. They're also both really old and elves, so they can relate to each other in that matter as well. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. It was a very, like, sillier, unscripted, just kind of like sitting down, being a little cozy, maybe even a little parasocial. I thought it'd be fun. I do a lot of scripted stuff nowadays, and sometimes I just want to sit down and word vomit. This is basically what it's like to tune into one of my live streams, honestly. This was very much lighthearted, a little silly, maybe a fun thing for Pride, because most of these couples in this video none of these couples are straight. Every character in Baldur's Gate is queer, so this one's for you, gay people. Why did I say it like that? Right. If you guys thought this was fun, if you enjoyed it, I'm so glad. Thank you for watching. I will see you all in my next video. I think my next Baldur's Gate related video might be a Cazador deep dive. No, don't tell him. Don't tell him we're doing a Cazador deep dive. I don't think he'd like that very much. So if you are interested in that, or if you're looking forward to just any kind of conversation about Baldur's Gate, you should consider subscribing if you're not already. I also talk a lot about Black Butler and animes, and I'm probably gonna make a Dungeon Meshi video in the near future, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and if you like Baldur's Gate, you're gonna like Dungeon Meshi. So that's the sneak peeks as to what's coming for the people who actually watched to the end of the video. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you guys. You're real ones. Bye!